Thanks for the assist. But what's the name of this team of yours?
You can call us Freedom Force.
Freedom Force is a squad-based real-time tactics game with RPG elements where you play as a team of unique superheroes or create your own. Unlike a lot of other superhero games, its art style, heroes, and story pay direct homage to comic books, specifically those from the period known as the Silver Age. Think less dark and brooding Batman and more bright spandex and campy dialogue.
All right, for freedom!
But don't let the vibrant, lighthearted style fool you. Freedom Force is actually a deep, very strategic, and at times challenging game, with a lengthy story that's packed with tropes and ideas from the era of comics it represents. Something that I usually see get mentioned whenever anyone talks about this game, which I feel like is necessary to echo here, is that Freedom Force really comes across as a work of passion, where its designers really loved comics, and did a fantastic job of turning that into a game that I think most strategy game fans can appreciate, comic book fan or not. It was released back in 2002 with a sequel that dropped a few years later, and both were developed by Irrational Games, who are mostly known these days for creating BioShock, and were mostly known back then for their work on System Shock 2, which is kinda surprising considering how drastically different the tones are in those games compared to Freedom Force. Thinking about Minuteman running around the Von Braun just makes my brain hurt. Freedom Force doesn't use any licensed properties, so its story and heroes are original to the game, although modders definitely had something to say about that. Freedom Force received a ton of praise back when it released and gave birth to a big modding community, but it's been sort of lost to time these days, despite its uniqueness and charm. It came out years before there were more Marvel movies than cells in your body, and there are a lot more superhero games now than there were back then, so maybe it got lost in the shuffle of all that, but I definitely think it's still worth revisiting. The comic book art style jumps out at you right away because 1, it's done extremely well, and 2, there aren't many other games I know of that try to mimic comics to this degree, which is surprising when I think about it because of how well it works here. The only other game that immediately comes to mind is the first-person shooter 13. The low-poly cartoonish graphics have aged really well, and a lot of the artwork still looks sleek and sharp. It's a great-looking game. And when you combine the comic book theme with the cartoonish sound design, the end result is incredibly charming. There are cutscenes that play out in small panels like you'd see in a comic book. I admit I'm not a big comic book person myself, but you really don't need to be to appreciate the way these scenes unfold. And from what I've learned, the style here and in many other aspects of the game closely mimic that of famous Silver Age artist Jack Kirby. During gameplay, there are text bubbles that pop up to show actions, status effects, or indicate damage, and big stylized automatopoeia which accompanies some of the exaggerated but not overdone sound effects. Out of all the comic-inspired touches to the visuals, I think this goes the furthest in really bringing that art style to life. It might seem like a minor thing, but it gels perfectly with what's happening in-game, and the designers did a great job of incorporating a lot of it so that it actually serves an important purpose, by giving you relevant combat info. The font used in the menus and the caption boxes for dialogue and narration are also in line with the comic book theme and keep that style persistent across the entire game. When it comes to the level design, there's an okay variety of different 3D environments where the campaign missions play out. Places like parks, a frozen aircraft carrier, and lots of city levels. The story makes it clear that a metropolis is the main setting, so this makes sense. A day and night cycle adds some variance to these areas, and there are a few more creative versions like an underground city, and a city having a forest-related identity crisis. Like all of the other artwork in the game, most of the environments are vibrant and colorful, with a few exceptions of darker and in some cases more bland locations, but these are more outliers than the norm. If you look close enough in the city areas, you can sometimes find cool little details like signs and billboards scattered around, but what's really cool about these places is that you can beat the absolute crap out of them. That's right, a lot of the levels are packed with destructible objects and structures. Sometimes it's part of a mission to destroy a building or save one from destruction, but if you really want to, you can turn your heroes into a demolition squad whenever you feel like it. You get a penalty for this at the end of a level, which can add up if you go too crazy, so it's usually something you try to avoid. But with a bunch of destructive superpowers at your fingertips, sometimes things can go awry, or you might just give into the temptation and decide to start your villain arc. Flying around beating up bad guys in any decent superhero game can be a fun power fantasy, but being able to actually topple cities puts Freedom Force on another level in that regard. Some of the powers have really cool status effects too, and can cause pandemonium in other ways. And when combined with the destructible environments, some solid animations, and fun physics effects, there are plenty of opportunities for mayhem. The cartoonish nature of the game makes these moments pretty funny, and even when something goes wrong and your heroes are on the wrong end of a disaster, it's hard not to laugh about it. To play Freedom Force effectively, you have to pause a lot, you can even slow down time, and there's a ton of camera control, so you can get some nice little action shots in the middle of fights or whenever things go crazy. Most of the hero and villain designs do have a kind of generic look to them, although I get the feeling that this was done intentionally to really fit with the Silver Age style. Putting a guy in a robot suit and calling him Manbot has to be intentional, right? It seems unfair to compare them to some of the really iconic heroes, but none of them really popped out at me as super interesting or creative from a visual standpoint. Their origin stories, and especially the voice acting, go a long way in giving them personality and making them likable though. The voice work is extremely campy and intentionally overdone in a way that perfectly fits the tone the game is aiming for. It's definitely one of the more memorable aspects of the game.
Yeah? And who are you supposed to be? George Washington?
Just another concerned citizen, friend. A citizen who knows that someone so powerful and brave would not stand idly by while the beautiful young women of this city are in peril.
I don't much care for being spied on. Why don't you come out here where old Dwight Arrow can see you?
I come as a friend, Dwight.
And why don't you just leave as one, too?
I've used my advanced knowledge to modify its behavioral circuits.
So now he's gonna behave like a gentleman?
Something to that effect.
If you are sad and all alone, cheer yourself with a psycho clone! Another clone to make you mad, another kid to call me Dad. My new clones see me as an idol. Too bad they're all homicidal.
The music reminds me of what you might hear during superhero or action-adventure cartoon shows, and if it sounds like I'm repeating myself when I say that it fits the vibe, it's because I am. There are some dramatic heroic themes and sinister villain tracks, but most of it's relatively subtle, with a lot of upbeat background music. The mood that's conveyed is usually optimistic until you reach some of the rising conflicts towards the end, and overall I have no complaints here. It's honestly hard for me to get over how awesome Freedom Force still looks and sounds. The style and silly tone might not work for everyone, but it definitely does for me, and Irrational Games undoubtedly nailed what they were going for here. It really gives off the impression that you're playing in a living, breathing comic book, and it represents an era and style of comics that you otherwise just don't see get treatment like this. But no comic book imitation would be complete without a story, since that's what comic books are after all. The Silver Age of comics that Freedom Force takes its themes from spanned from the mid-1950s through the 60s. So, as one might expect, the game takes place almost smack dab in the middle of that in 1962, in a metropolis called Patriot City. And the story immediately kicks off by delving into some fears that were relevant during that period, as you take on some Cold War enemies who want to steal a nuclear bomb. And when I say cold, I mean that literally, since you face off against Nuclear Winter, an icy Russian supervillain who leaves a path of frozen terrain in his wake. It's a clever and funny take on Cold War sentiments, but he's just one of the many supervillains you have to fight against. There are 6 in total, and each has their own set of minions. Once you've dealt with one, another pops right up, giving the story an episodic nature and adding plenty of variety to the different types of enemies you encounter. None of the rest are quite as cleverly crafted as Nuclear Winter, but they still have enough quirks and interesting powers so that, on the whole, they fit their roles well. Some are definitely cliché, but in a fun and eccentric way that keeps the mood light. Even the semi-standard mob boss is a great nemesis, because with lines like this, how could he not be?
Oh, he needs some medical attention. Oh, I'm so broken-hearted I think I'm gonna cry. That's what you get for hanging out with the wrong crowd, kid.
Your team of heroes dub themselves Freedom Force, and there are a lot of cutscenes and tons of dialogue among them, both in between and during missions. The plot is by no means complex or super interesting, but it doesn't try to be. It's more about maintaining the campy style and really fitting the comic book mold, like how most missions end by revealing a new conflict in the fashion of comic book cliffhangers. What I think is the best part of the story, and where it seems the most attention went, are the origin stories. Besides just being awesomely stylish cutscenes, they give brief backstories that make the heroes feel like more than just random people with capes. Not all heroes have one, but the most important ones do, and they embody some of the major characteristics used during the Silver Age, like an explanation rooted in science fiction for how the heroes got their powers, using evil aliens, a spaceship crash, and a mysterious substance known as Energy X to quickly establish why they can suddenly fly or pick up cars. Most of the heroes also have flaws, or were greatly troubled or filled with regret prior to obtaining their powers. There's a heavy focus on this in particular, and it usually helps convey their motivations and makes them feel more human. Except for this guy, I'm still not really sure what his deal is.
I must spend the rest of eternity in exile amongst simple primates who have never even traveled the stars.
The gameplay mechanics are a far breath away from just running around Hulk smashing everyone. Combat is real-time with pause, with a heavy emphasis on the pause part of that. Fights happen frequently, and there's a lot of micromanaging involved if you want to play efficiently and stay alive, even during the early levels. This doesn't mean that your heroes are weak, but they definitely rely on you to activate their powers at the right moments, in the right areas, and preferably in a way where you're not butchering your own squad. Friendly fire is definitely something to watch out for, especially with ranged powers and status effects. This might get a little frustrating at first, but it's a testament to the amount of strategy involved with tackling the campaign missions, which can be thrilling if you enjoy this kind of tactics game. And it's also pretty unique, considering this isn't the type of gameplay you usually see in superhero games. There are environmental factors to consider like line of sight, the destructible buildings, range of attack, and elevation. If an enemy is flying, you can't hit them with melee attacks. And if they're hanging out on a rooftop, you need someone who can jump or fly up there to get them. Or use a ranged attack, or maybe you can find something to throw. Being able to destroy so much stuff on the map is really cool, but being able to pick things up and use them as weapons is even better. Your stronger heroes can throw all kinds of things like cars and explosive barrels, or rip a lamppost or traffic light out of the ground and start caveman clubbing enemies with it. This is a blast, and it offers some of the best ways to dish out punishment early on, not to mention it looks hilarious. Eventually, powers and regular attacks overtake the damage you can do here, but it's still a fun option to have, and some advantages like range of attack remain useful. On the progression side of things, you have some full-blown RPG mechanics. The amount of customization options for hero creation is borderline insane, but we'll talk more about that part soon. Experience comes from simply completing the campaign missions and picking up occasional bonus items. In between missions, you can raise hero powers up to 5 levels, with the third unlocking the ability to purchase a new power. You have to progress in the order the powers are listed, which can make it feel sort of like you're wasting points if you're buying one solely to unlock what's below it. There are definitely powers that I don't use much, even when unlocked, but enough useful powers are there so that along with being able to raise the powers you do use, I think it's overall a rewarding system. But I still kinda wish you could just skip the ones you don't think you'll rely on, so you could put the points into something more useful. With that said, the variety of different powers available is more than sufficient to make each hero feel unique, and gives you a bunch of different ways to approach combat situations. There are 8 different types of powers, ranging from standard melee or projectile attacks to defensive and even special powers that give unique abilities like super speed or being able to travel underground. The game forces you to experience a good chunk of this by putting limits on which heroes you can or can't use for certain missions. You do still get to mostly pick your squad, but sometimes there's one or maybe a couple of heroes that you have to use or that stay behind for story reasons. And I'm glad they added these restrictions because I think the variety of heroes and powers is one of the game's major strengths. And the heroes you don't use still do gain experience, so they won't end up underleveled. You can get an extensive rundown of everything powers do and a lot more in the character menu. And there's some solid depth here. A whole host of different damage types, some of which cause status effects like stun or rage, material types as in what an enemy or hero is made of, which gives them various resistances and vulnerabilities. There are also attributes which do nearly as much as powers to define a hero. This is what determines things like whether a hero can fly or jump on buildings, and there are tons more which add various strengths and, more interestingly, weaknesses. You can also over and underpower attacks during combat, which is dependent on a hero's energy levels. I think you're starting to get the idea of how intricate the combat system is. There's a lot that goes into fights, but everything is mostly intuitive enough that Freedom Force never felt overly complex, even during the toughest or most chaotic fights. It's a fun system, and while the art style might seem like the game's biggest draw, the gameplay is surprisingly just as good. The heroes are mostly well balanced too. El Diablo can dish out powerful fire attacks, but his hot-tempered attribute makes the intensity of these attacks unpredictable, and might result in him stunning himself. Manbot is a very tanky and powerful brawler, but slow as a crippled turtle until you unlock his ability to fly. Super Collider is just flat out OP, but only becomes available late in the campaign and is expensive to purchase with prestige points, a separate currency from experience that you get for killing enemies and completing objectives. As I mentioned before, you can also create your own heroes and make them as balanced or as unbalanced as you want. Hero creation is extremely customizable with tons of options to choose from, down to minor details of individual powers. You can even name and pick the animations for powers. It's as much a power creator as a hero creator. Your biggest limit here is your imagination, and the only thing lacking are the skins, but that's where mods come in. Freedom Force was designed to be very moddable, and even today I had no trouble finding a great mod site with a ridiculous amount of options to choose from, including skins for nearly every licensed hero and enemy I could think of. So if you want to make the Hulk, Superman, Magneto, whoever, chances are there's a skin for it. Installing them is very simple. You just drag and drop into a custom characters or skins folder in your game files, and then voila. You can use custom heroes in the campaign, but the issue with this is that you still have to pay prestige points to recruit them, just like you do for the other optional heroes that pop up during the campaign. If you decide to make a really powerful hero, which is of course what you'd want to do, then they become incredibly expensive to recruit, and you can't level up their powers the same way you can the pre-made heroes for some reason, so there's no creating a weak hero that gets stronger powers later. You technically could play through the campaign as Superman, but it would have to be a weak and puny version of Superman, otherwise you just won't be able to afford him until like the last mission, if at all. And nobody wants to play as weak and puny Superman. This is disappointing, but not terribly so, at least for me, because I do really like using the standard heroes for the campaign, since there's plenty of variety among them and they're directly involved with the story. But with a creation system this robust, it does seem like a wasted opportunity to not have it integrated in the campaign in a better way. However, there are challenge modes and custom matches where you can use anyone your heart desires to fight against anyone your heart desires for no cost at all. And I mean anyone, like a squad of random enemies and NPCs. You can play as a T-Rex teamed up with a police chief, a bank manager, and a giant ant if you want to. Or use mods to make a team of your favorite heroes fight against your favorite villains. Or send out the Hulk to take on an army of cops, or make Superman beat up a bunch of dinosaurs. These kinds of matches aren't nearly as nuanced as the campaign missions, but with all of the customization options, they can definitely still be fun and hilarious to toy around with. The sequel to Freedom Force vs. the Third Reich, came out 3 years after the original game, and in it, Freedom Force goes back in time to fight against Nazis and the other Axis powers. It does have a few differences from the original, but overall things are pretty similar, and I think it's a worthy follow-up. There were major hints of a third game at the end of the sequel, but this unfortunately never happened. Freedom Force did get a comic book tie-in, and there are mods that add their own campaign missions if you're hungry for more, but officially the series has been dormant since 2005, without so much as a peep of any kind of revival that I'm aware of. Thankfully, both games are available digitally, and you can get them packaged together for very cheap. The Steam version apparently has some technical problems that require fixes, so if you don't feel like dealing with that, you're better off getting it from GOG. Something that's proved true to me on multiple occasions now, which my time with Freedom Force supports, is that it's almost always fun for me to experience games from developers who are fueled by high levels of passion, even if it's something that ventures outside the realms of what I'm usually interested in. Freedom Force's gameplay is right up my alley, but comic books have never been my thing, not really for any reason other than there being other forms of media already occupying my attention. But this in no way prevented me from enjoying the game's style, humor, and themes. These aspects of Freedom Force are awesome, and I do recommend checking it out if this type of real-time tactics game suits you.